So this is my second time I give you the welcome, and this time is at the other campus of the BSc, which is Bellaterra. Some of you have classes here and some others do not, so you may have discovered these other campus. They're both very different, and we believe both are very nice. So just want to give you this second welcome. I hope you have enjoyed the brush-ups. Got a taste of BSc and get encouraged to get to the real thing, which are the masters. I just want to present Ada Ferrer Carbonell. She's Deputy Director for Academic Programs, and she's going to give you some words as she could not come to the welcome in Ciutadella, and she's going to give the welcome today. Ada.
Hello, everyone, dear students, dear faculty, dear team, dear class 2024-2025, welcome to the BSc in the Bellaterra campus. As Teresa was saying, my name is Ada Ferrer, and I am the director of the academic programs of the BSc. This is to say that I help with the academic organization of all the BSc academic programs, the master programs, the summer school, and the professional courses. Unfortunately, this year I could not be at the welcoming in Ciutadella on September the 2nd, but I'm very happy to officially welcome you today at the BSc. I want to take this opportunity to wish you a very fruitful year, full of learning experiences, and to make myself available for anything you might need. The program directors, the faculty, the program officers, Ariana, Elga, and all the team work together to ensure that you have a successful and unique learning experience. I hope you are enjoying the first days at the BSc. And beyond the intense brush-up, I hope you also had the opportunity to explore the Barcelona area and to slowly get to know each other. This will be a very special year. Some of your classmates will become your friends, and all of them will be part of your network for the rest of your life. Today, we are gathered to officially open the 2024-2025 academic year with the inaugural lecture given by Professor Jaume Ventura. After the lecture, and as you have already been announced, you will have the opportunity to watch something remarkable, els castellers, human towers. This is a Catalan tradition, quite spectacular, and I'm sure you all enjoy it very much. The castellers work as a team to achieve amazing results, in the same way that you will work together during the master to learn and to take the maximum out of this year. I won't tell you more about the castellers, but you definitely have to stay and see them. Let us start today's opening with the BSc opening lecture for the 2024-2025 academic year that will be delivered by, as I just say, Professor Jaume Ventura. Jaume Ventura is the director of CREI, one of the 4 academic units of the Barcelona School of Economics. Jaume is a senior researcher of CREI and professor at the University Pompeu Fabra and at the Barcelona School of Economics. He received his PhD from Harvard University, and prior to coming to Barcelona, he was professor at MIT. Jaume is a world-recognized economist in macroeconomics and international economics. He is the recipient of 2 advanced grants from the European Research Council, Fellow of the Econometric Society, and the European Economic Association. Jaume has been the editor and associate editor of some of the most important journals in economics: the Economic Journal, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the Review of Economics and Statistics, and the Journal of the European Economic Association. As many of you very well know, Jaume is also the director, together with Fernando Bronner, sitting in the back, of the Master in the International Trade, Finance and Development program, which is within the BSc Specialized Economic Analysis Master programs. I could talk hours about Jaume and his achievements, but let's start without further delay with his lecture, who will talk about European trade and politics. Welcome, Jaume.
Thank you very much, Ada, for the introduction. Thank you very much to all of you for being here. being here even knowing that tomorrow at 8:30 you have to come and listen to me again. So I really appreciate that for the IT of the students. Let me tell you a little bit, let me take this opportunity to talk a little bit about why we do some of the research we do and the topics or the questions that interest us. Okay? Let me start with a particular figure. If you take a look at this red line here, the red line here is merchandise trade as a share of world GDP. It's total trade divided by GDP. And if you can see, there are kind of two big periods in which trade grew a lot in the world. That's world data. The first period goes from 1815 until the beginning of the First World War, which is 1914. This period, 1815, is a very special year. Is the Congress, for the history of Europe at least, is the Congress of Vienna, just when Napoleon lost finally his empire, and Europe started to set an agreement for peace and stability, and started a period, the 19th century, which there was much less war than any time that we know before. There were wars, for sure, but it was much more peaceful, much more stable, and so on. And during that period, we see that trade grew a lot until 1914. This is what historians call the first wave of globalization. Now you can see that trade fell dramatically during the two world wars and in between, and then it started to grow again in 1950 until today. And this is what historians call the second wave of globalization. That's all very interesting, it's fine. We know that this is what has happened. Typically, periods of peace are associated with large increases in trade. Periods of war and so on are associated with very declines in trade, substantial declines in trade. What is interesting is that we also use this measure of international trade as a measure of economic integration. And now some economists, for many, many years, have been looking at this figure, and they have put on top of it the following line, the blue line. What's the blue line? The blue line is the number of countries in the world. So for example, if you take a look at this blue line here, there were a few less than 100 countries. Now you have to look at this side here. And they almost double the number of countries during the second wave of globalization. That observation led to many papers. Many papers. People were writing, why is it that at the same time that we observe more economic integration, there seems to be more political disintegration? Countries, as we have more countries, that means that they are small. The size of the world has not changed during this period, and we have occupied all of it. So what you try to see is, why are they becoming more small? Why are they smaller? What is going on? Why is it that economic integration and political integration do not go hand in hand? Now, this is something that there were a number of papers and a lively debate, but at some point we started to think, what happened in the first wave of globalization? Do we observe the same phenomenon or not? And actually that was in the mind, that I'm going to tell you a little bit the results of a paper that I did with two colleagues of mine, Gino Gancia and Giacomo Ponzetto, who also teaches in the programs here. And Giacomo and I started to think, what happens during the periods before? Actually, it turns out that it's not easy to calculate how many countries there were before World War I. Sometimes historians use a variety of measures. Some of them might be number of embassies. If you have an embassy in London, then you are a country. If you don't, you are just a protectorate or something else. There are a variety of measures. I'm not going to bore you with that. But we took a look at these measures. We constructed something. And we found that, indeed, the first wave of globalization, the opposite occurred. In the second wave of globalization, you see that more and more trade leads to political disintegration. But in the first wave of globalization, more and more trade led to a political integration. Under what conditions does economic integration go together with political integration? Under what conditions it doesn't? Why do we see these differences here? So now that's an interesting question that we are curious about it. And we want to say something. We want to try to understand what are the potential theories, what are the potential thoughts. Actually, we were more interested in Europe, and we wanted to make sure this is world data. and we want to know whether that happens in Europe. And I could just put the same numbers for Europe and so on, but I'm going to do it with a picture so that you can see clearly what's going on in Europe. Let me show you Europe in 1815. Okay, that's Europe in 1815. That's just at the time of the Congress of Vienna. Let's fast forward 1 century to the beginning of the First World War. You see? Don't you see that there is a strong process of political integration? One doesn't need to do fancy econometrics to find that. And actually, our econometrics professors might not like this comment, but you don't need fancy econometrics to determine that there has been a substantial process of political integration over the 19th century. But then let's fast forward one other century ahead, 2014, and you can see again that there is a political disintegration in Europe. You see? So these three figures give you exactly what the same other numbers did. And I want to think about this event. How do you think about that? How do you start thinking about these issues? Well, when we think about these issues, we need to find a good theory, a good story. We don't have a lot of theories of border formation or how the state changes geographically over time. We have relatively few theories. I'm going to tell you some of the choices that we did in that paper. That's a paper that we wrote about 10 years ago, the first draft, but it was published just last year. So this takes you about the lags in publication that sometimes you see in the profession. The first thing that Giacomo, Gino, and I started to think about is we're going to be good economists. We're going to take the view that changes in borders can be explained by economic efficiency, so that they respond to economic incentives. That's probably not the entire story, that's not everything, but the reason why borders can change, like economic systems and other, might be driven by economic factors. So we started by thinking, how could that be? And then we had to take some tactical decisions. When you try to think about the theory, you cannot explain a theory of everything because the model becomes too complex, and you will see that in your lectures in the course of this year, that the best models are many times very simple, but they give you very good insights. Now, we had to decide what we leave behind, and we decided to take away from this first analysis of the question, ignore cultural globalization. We say, we think that economic globalization is moving much faster than cultural globalization. It's still true. Now we buy goods from everywhere in the world. We trade, we buy things everywhere and so on. But still, people feel strong their national identities, people feel strongly their local preferences, and so on and so forth. And that we took as a moment, as something to simplify. The second, we focus on international conflict and ignore domestic conflict. Then when you bring back these elements, as we might come, they might turn out not to matter that much, or they might turn out to change the theory in a clear way, but sometimes you want to think in this way. And then we used off-the-shelf theory and lots of symmetry. And when we started to play, we started to see that there are a variety of factors that could matter. There's a literature. There's a literature in the field, and this literature in the field tended to emphasize these three first effects, and we added another one, the fourth. What do you mean? We mean that the efficient political structure, the sort of countries that appear in equilibrium, are going to be defended on a variety of effects. Preference matching. What does preference matching? That's an assumption that people do in their models, that if the government is very small, if you are in a small country, there are very small differences in preferences, and the government is close to you. It's going to do the sort of policies that you like. If instead it's a government, you have an empire, very, very large country, the government cannot satisfy the preferences of everybody. It's going to be far away from everyone. It's going to be something a little bit different. So, for example, the preference matching means that if you want to have a government that is close to people, you want to have a country that is small. You don't want to have a country that is very, very large, a government that is far away to you and that has to cater to many people that are different. So that's a force for having small countries. On the other hand, there are economies of scale. Economies of scale in the provision of government services, in creating a government, and all of that. And these economies of scale would suggest have a large country because you can save those economies of scale. And the other thing that we added to the literature, but there was already some literature on this, was about the border effect. There's a strong evidence, and I will show you some numbers later, that the fact that there are borders, national borders, the borders constitute an impediment to trade. There is a lot more trade within countries than across countries. And I will show you some data later that tries to justify that point. What we added on top of this discussion, which is something that previous models of political structure had not considered, is the presence of economies of scope. What's the difference between economies of scale and economies of scope? Economies of scale says that if I do the same thing many times, the cost of doing it declines. You're with me? So if I do the same thing many, many times, the cost of it declines. So it's the same thing. Do it over and over. Economies of scope says that if I do many different things, the average cost is lower than if I do only one thing, and somebody else does it. So that's what economies of scope are. In the fact that if a same decision maker takes various decisions, it's less costly than if you have one decision maker for every decision, and then they have to coordinate and have coordination costs. So this is a new thing. The governments do many things, but you don't have to have the same government doing it all the time. Now, what are these things saying? Well, preference matching says, I want a country that is small. Economies of scale says, I want a country that is large. Border effect says, if trade is important, I don't want many borders. I want to have few countries that are very large too. And economies of scope, the governments do many things. I don't want to break that down. I want to have a single government that does everything for me. Now, what do we observe in this theory? I'm not going to derive all the equations, not even one, but I'm going to say a few of the results of the theory. So we create this little world with different countries, with all these elements in it, and first we ask, what would happen if this world were able to resolve their differences through law and diplomacy? We could all sit and negotiate and do something that is good for all of us. That's what you find. Let me show you this picture, because this picture summarizes that. That gamma that you see here, that gamma in the bottom, are the gains from trade. Globalization reduces transport costs and raises the gains from trade. Okay? What do we observe here? In a symmetric world, in a world where there is no asymmetry in geography and so on, is the size of a country, the size of the average country, if you want to know. Okay? And here, what do you observe? That as the gains from trade increase, we want to take advantage of these gains from trade, and therefore we want to make countries larger, larger, larger. That's, for instance, why you have the unification of Germany, the Zollverein and the unification of Germany. That's why you have the unification of Italy. That's why some countries expand. That's why colonial empires were built, to trade at an advantaging cost, an exploitative way, but to trade and to take advantage of the new gains from trade that were possible. Now, as the gains from trade increases, the model tells you that the size of the countries increase. The reason why the size of the countries increase is because you have the nation state. A nation state is like a government that does everything for you. But as the gains from trade are larger, you want to have a larger government. You are accepting a government that is larger and not as good to you as a country that were smaller, country that have different tastes, a country that is farther from you. But you're accepting it because you can trade more and gain in per capita income. You can be richer. And that's what, in this model, if people had representatives and they could sit in a table, that's what you would observe as equilibrium. As the gains from trade increases, the size of the country would increase. But there comes a point that these countries are too large. The government, you don't feel represented by the government anymore. The government is doing things that you don't like, is forcing policies that are homogenizing to everybody within the country. And at that point, it becomes valuable to have a country that, a nation, a political structure that is different than the nation state. One of the big revolutions after the Second World War was the appearance of international organizations. You now are familiar and accustomed to think about the World Trade Organization, the organization about trade, about migration, about everything. There are all sorts of international organizations. The World Bank, all these institutions, the European Union here. None of those existed before. Each country did everything, and all treaties, there were treaties once in a while, but they would disappear 3 years later or 4 years later. Having now supranational entities that have power over governments is something totally new. And that's a little bit what has happened here. Now we have delegated to a few international unions, to a few international organizations or international unions, and in the case of Europe, this is the case I want to talk, think about it. At some point we say, let's keep growing, let's keep growing, let's keep growing, and at some point it becomes better to have a European Union, that this European Union will take care of all the economics of the problems, and then have small countries that when it comes to choosing what health service do you want, what education do you want for your children, what type of justice system do you want, and so on and so forth, you can choose it at a local scale. You don't need to have it imposed from very far away. So it turns out that when the gains from trade are more and more important, rather than accepting a worse government in order to take advantage for trade, you take a more expensive government because of economies of scope. Now we have a European Union and we have the local governments. We have multiplied by 2 the levels of governments, and that's expensive. We are giving up economies of scope. We have a more expensive government in order to avoid having a government that is very far away from us. So that's a little bit what the theory has. The theory can also analyze a number of other issues, which I will not have time to discuss all the details. But for example, I told you that this is the equilibrium, that we call it law and diplomacy, because in this equilibrium, people in the world sit in a big table and they negotiate. What's the right size of the government? What do we want? And the negotiations are happy negotiations, in the sense that the best that can possibly be achieved happens. But what happens if some countries can impose borders on others because they have, for example, a military technology or something of that sort? Well, we find the following results in that case. When there is a world in which you can choose between law and diplomacy or war and conquest, you have countries that here at the very beginning, there is law and diplomacy, that's the same as before. They live separately, they might have their little wars and so on, but everyone has its own country, and at some moment, it comes the moment in which the countries become really large, really big empires. These empires are exploitative. And you can see that the empires keep growing, and at some point not even the empires are cost effective in our theory. And you move to the world with 2 layers of government, the local level or the national level and the international level. Now, there are a number of predictions of this theory. The first prediction of this theory is that in the period before World War I, which is the period that after World War II, before World War I represents this period here, where there is no 2 layers of governments. Whenever there is an increase in trade, that should lead to an increase in the size of the countries. So countries that start trading a lot, they should annex others, or countries should become larger, peacefully or non-peacefully. That's what you would observe. Afterwards, that's not the case. Annexation should not be predicted by trade. A part of the paper was to collect data about that, and here I'm not going to read the table in detail, but essentially what you see when you go in this table, what we try to show with this table is that indeed there is some evidence in favor of that view. that before the First World War, territorial expansions were followed increases in trade. While afterwards, we don't see any correlation with increases in trade and territorial expansions. Another prediction of the theory that we emphasize in the paper is that in the first part, on the first wave of globalization, where we have the pure nation state, changes in borders should be conflictual. While in the second part of the globalization, they should be much less conflictual. Once again, these are difficult things to test, but we do have data sets which measure all the border changes that have happened in history, or at least that are recorded, and they can tell how violent they were in terms of how many people died around the dates as a result of this border change. And if you look, it is certainly in the 19th century border changes led to many more deaths than in the 20th in the second half of the 20th century. There were in both cases substantial changes in borders, but the violence surrounding these changes in borders was quite different before and abroad. Now, what have we learned from this piece of work? What have we learned? Well, the things we learned is that in the first wave of globalization, in order to satisfy the gains from trade, in order to benefit from the gains from trade, we moved to countries that were larger and larger and that were more distant from the people that they were governing. In the case of imperialism, it's even very clear, because there was a metropolis that took some other countries and governed them without paying attention to the preferences of the locals at all. In the second wave of globalization, it seems that globalization has reached a level in which it is better to create a multi-level governance, small countries plus economic unions in Europe. That's what we chose as Europeans. And in that case, we have less war. In Europe, there has been few wars. I feel bad about saying that, given the situation currently between Russia and Ukraine, and also what's happening across the sea in Israel and so on. But generally, by all standards, the last decades in Europe have been more peaceful than any other time in our history. Not peaceful enough, but more peaceful. Now, during this period, we choose a more expensive government because to satisfy these gains from trade. There's a number of results that come from the theory. We used a lot of symmetry. But now if you put countries in different continents, so that transport costs are low among some, transport costs are low between the others, but large between the two continents, you're going to see that the theory tells you first you would have worldwide empires, but when the war is too costly, then you're going to revert to regional unions, surprisingly. So you go from small countries, world empires, then you go back to regional unions and eventually to a world union if the gains of trade become very large. These are different scenarios that can come up from the model. What do we do with this story? We wrote that paper. We were happy. It showed that it gives us some way of understanding why political structure is affected by globalization and why the way it is affected can vary over time. Why in the first wave it was in one way, political integration and economic integration went together, while in the second wave it looks differently. Should we be happy with that? Just claim victory and move on to something else? I mean, one of the things is that a lot of the pieces of the story, the more I played with them, the less I liked, the less satisfied I was. Either I didn't like some of them, or even if I didn't like, I didn't know whether they were true or not. So that's kind of it has led to a number of other research papers. And don't worry, I will not explain all of them to you. Okay, don't worry about that. But that has led to trying to understand some of this view, to what merits does it have. That happens in research collectively. Other researchers criticize and put alternatives or look at some data implications that didn't work, but it also happens internally. You have to be critical. You have to be your best or the strongest critic of yourself when you do these things. Now, there were very aspects of this model that I was not sure that they make sense to me. The first thing was to revisit the assumptions about governments. What are the two key assumptions that were underlying the story? The first one is that in a large country, a central government cannot cater to the differences of the different peoples living in the country. Why is it that the central government cannot do it? And local governments can do it? Is the central government inept? Has a worse technology? Why cannot the central government do the same policies in each of the different regions or in each of the different geographical units of this country, whatever they want, and not the same for everything, which perhaps nobody likes? Well, that's something, and more interestingly also, there is a long literature that has been always asking, has taken as a given what the country is, and has asked how should power be distributed among geographically within the country. It's the old question, if you want, of centralization versus decentralization. What's the optimal degree? Actually, I thought about this, and I realized that there were many things of the previous theory I didn't like. There were others that I liked better when I thought. I wrote a paper about that. That's one of the questions that arose. I'm not going to tell you what this paper does now, although you are all welcome to go to my page and read it this evening, if you want to. Now, the second thing is, a very important thing here was we create these unions, we create these two-level governments because they reduce the border effects. But how large are these border effects? Do international unions really eliminate these border effects? What do we know about the data on that? On this I will tell you a few words in a few minutes, okay? Then there are other questions. These are two papers that have been finished. One I'm still, it has not been published, but soon will be. The others, these are additional questions. The next question that I have in mind is, can I measure the quantitative consequences of border changes in Europe? What would happen if we change borders in Europe? We all think about Catalonia asking for independence. Scotland had a vote and it was quite close. There are other places. What would happen if we change a little bit the geography of power in Europe? What would be the consequences? Who would gain? Who would lose? From a quantitative viewpoint. How important are the asymmetries? In the theory I did before, it was a uniform geography. Sometimes I put two continents, but there were simple geographies. Now, let's think in a model that has a geography that looks like the real world, with the strong asymmetries. Are the results still survive? Are the results, how do they matter quantitatively? That's something that we are exploring in a paper where there's a very preliminary draft with Doruk Gopal and Ugur Yesil Bayraktar that I wrote here. And more general, how should borders be decided? What are the key trade-offs? Are those that we were discussing or not, or others? This is something that I want to do some more research, and there's a few projects more going on. What I want to do what I want to do in these 10 minutes I have, more or less, or yes, very good. In the minutes what I have is I want to tell you a little bit about this. How large is the border effect? Okay. Now, imagine you want to measure how large is the border effect. This is a paper that let me tell you a little bit. Let's think about Europe. Okay. Let's think about Europe. And we know that the European Union has removed trade barriers with the intention to create a single market where the goods, people flow freely without costs. In a sense, when you hear that definition, in the minds of those that created this, the creation of a single market, was the idea of eliminating border effects. They didn't like national markets. They wanted to have a single European market where people can interact and people can benefit from the gains from trade all over Europe. However, we know that national governments still are protectionistic, and this protectionism might still hamper international trade. For example, there are lots of studies that show that domestic courts have a bias towards domestic citizens. If you are an exporter somewhere and something happens and you go to the courts, the local courts, you are going to be at a disadvantage with the locals. That's something that is very well documented. There are studies, for example, there's a very famous study in New York where a bunch of lawyers were given all the proceedings of different trials, and they were given everything except the nationality of the two parties. And the lawyer said, well, here they probably ruled for the plaintiff, here they ruled for somebody, here they ruled for whatever. And actually, the predictions of the lawyers were identity-less. So they did not have any bias. They couldn't have it because they didn't know who the persons were litigating there. But actually it turned out that later on they looked at it and the probability of getting a good ruling is lower if one of the plaintiffs was Japanese. They were Japanese versus locals. Okay? And very similar situations. And if you were Japanese, you were having US courts were treating you differently than if you were a local. But that's not only the US. Perhaps in Japan it happens the opposite. And this happens here, it happens everywhere. Now, other things, technical standards can be chosen strategically to protect domestic producers. That happens all the time. Procurement contracts may be allocated to domestic products. In fact, the home bias of governments is amazing. Government procurement governments are about 40%. They spend about 40% of all GDP or more. A big chunk of that 40% goes to wages. But another big chunk goes to buying stuff. This is a public university, and the government has bought the tables, has bought the lights, has bought everything, has built this. The home bias in procurement is tremendous. Almost 90% of what the governments spend, they spend on local goods, and that's true, and so on. That creates a home bias also in trade, whatever. And then there's question of infrastructure. Infrastructure also favors domestic trade. Governments typically do infrastructure to connect different parts of the country, and they are much less interested in making infrastructure that connects across countries. There are many cases that one can talk. And we can ask, how close is Europe from eliminating the harmful effect of national borders in trade? Borders negatively affect trade. How much? How do we do that? Now, the problem of answering this question, the first is the data. If you think for a second, and you want to say something empirical about that, you're thinking about, let's make a comparison. I want to compare two geographical units, perhaps two regions of Europe, that are within a country, how much do they trade? And regions of Europe that are in different countries, how much do they trade? I want to compare intra-country trade with inter-country trade. You're with me? That's the way to compare and see whether inter-country trade is more than intra-country trade. The problem is that we don't have trade statistics at the regional level. We don't have them in Europe. We don't have it anywhere. We have fantastic trade statistics, but they are at the country level. Trade statistics are collected by customs officers when they want to collect custom duties, they want to put taxes, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of information about how Spanish firms trade with Indonesians. How much do we, from Spain we sell to Indonesia, or to New Zealand, or to Panama. But we don't know how much Catalonia sells to Languedoc-Roussillon, or Alsace, or Midi-Pyrenees. We don't have this data. Now, the first challenge to answer this question was to find the data. How do we do that? And I'm not going to explain you how, but with Marta Santamaria and Ugur Yeshil Bayraktar, we found a survey of shipments by truck in Europe. All the trade that takes place in truck. About 50% of European trade in manufacturing, agriculture and mining is done by truck. And we use this data, which we have at a very disaggregated level, to construct trade among European regions. And then we can compare whether two regions within a country tend to trade less than two regions that are in different countries, two pairs. The construction of this data is a major contribution of the paper, and certainly the 95% of the time we were devoted to that. It's not that much fun, but it's exciting to see the results at the end. And let me show you, thanks to this data, we can now have pictures like the one I'm going to show you, this one here. If you take a look at here, all the regions in Europe at the NUTS 2 level. This is one of the classifications of the European Union. This thing here that you observe, there are about 270 regions. Here we have Catalonia, it's in gray, it's a different and so on. And what we are saying is, who are the markets for Catalan products? Where does Catalonia sell? How much does it sell? As a proportion of the size of the market. You see, as a proportion. Obviously, Catalonia sells not too much to Aragon, which is the one here, because Aragon is very small. It's very few people. They're not very rich. We don't sell that much to them. But if you say as a share of what Aragon buys, it's tremendously large, in the sense that it's about 11% or 12% of what Aragon buys, it buys from Catalonia. You are with me? So now if you take a view at here, you will see this is of the consumption basket of the region, how much does it spend? So for example, if you take this region here, I've never understood why they buy a substantial amount of Catalan products. I have no idea. But if you look at the north of Finland here, or if you look at places that are far away, they buy very little. It's natural. But if you take a look at this picture, the first thing that will come to mind is that the best markets for Catalonia are in the rest of Spain. You see? It's very clear. These are the ones that buy more. Now, obviously, you want to make sure that when you compare trade in Catalonia with other regions in Spain and trade in Catalonia with regions outside of Spain, obviously we will say we trade more with us in Spain. But there are other reasons why we trade more with those in Spain. They are closer. They are nearby. Distance, the geographical, the cost of transport, and everything is much lower. In fact, the second part of the paper is to try to disentangle to what extent this is due to the border or is not due to the border. And the task is not easy, because if you look at, for example, in the next picture says borders are not randomly assigned. This is the probability of having a border with Catalonia. How do we calculate this probability? We look back 300, 500 years ago and ask, which regions are likely to be in the same country half a millennia later or a millennia later? And you look at geographical factors. And these geographical factors tell you which are the ones we didn't know about the structure of Europe and how Europe ended up being. Now, you take that model to predict, and for example, it says that Aragon had a low probability of having a border with Catalonia. It was very unlikely. It was likely to be in the same country. Languedoc-Roussillon here too, Midi-Pyrenees as well, Valencia as well, but as you go farther away, there is less probability. It's explained by distance, by geographical obstacles, like mountains, like the presence of rivers, a bunch of variables that we use to predict these borders. What it seems very clear is that borders are not randomly assigned. If I do these comparisons, if I compare trade within countries and trade across countries, I'm not using the same sample. because the treatment which is having a border is very much correlated with distance. It's like if I want to find out what is the effect of some medication, what I would do is to take all of you and give it randomly to you, and then half of you will have it randomly, half of you would not, the two samples would be similar, and I would be able to do a comparison. But if I give the medication to those that are very, very healthy, to give the medication, and those that are not healthy, I don't give them the medication, and I compare the samples, obviously you don't know whether it's the medication or it's the initial conditions that are determining that the guys with the medication are doing better than the guys without it. You are with me? So here is the same. And the whole paper tries to assess that. I'm going to give you only some of the results we find, because I find them to be quite striking still. So what do we find? What do we find? Once we have a strategy to determine how to control for this, and obviously the entire intellectual exercise and so on is about that, okay, which I skipped totally here, and so on, we find that borders reduce market shares to 17.5% of their potential. So if you take two region pairs, for example, you take trade between Catalonia and Languedoc-Roussillon. There's a border here. And trade between Catalonia and Valencia. There's no border here. This one here is 17.5% of what it would be if there were no border. And that's a very big border effect within Europe today. Or if you want to do the inverse, if we remove the border, trade would increase by a factor of 5. That's a lot. So it seems that borders, national borders, still are very important in Europe. That's something that surprised us. At least until now, the European Union is far from creating an internal market, a single market. The second thing that we observe is that we could have data. In this exercise of the data, we could construct trade data for many industries. We had in particular 12. Some industries we discarded, because, for example, those that are, for example, oil goes with oleoducts, or ships mostly, not with trucks. We discarded some industries, but we found that the border effects are large in all industries, and this number of 17.5 ranges, when you do it at the industry level, from 38.9 to 12.3. So even the industries that are less affected by national borders, you still observe that they trade only 40% of what they would have traded otherwise. Interesting observation. Europe, as I showed you at the very beginning, has a lot of new borders, because the last century has been a century and almost has doubled the number of countries. Do you remember? So what happens if we look at borders that existed before 1910 and borders that existed after 1910? Do we observe a different border effect? And the answer is yes, quite significant. Relatively new borders, and these are post-1910 borders, so relatively new means that they have been created in the last century. These borders reduce trade still substantially to 28.3% of their trade. Now, why do borders have these effects? Because of the reasons I mentioned before, through other reasons. Borders, for example, are typically, they do have, one of the things that you observe with borders is when you create a border, there's a lot of homogenization of cultures and tastes within a country, and that promotes internal trade and not external trade. So, for example, we observe that having a border raises by 71.4% the probability of not having different languages, raises the probability of not having different languages, or having the same language. That was a mistake. It raises the distance traveled. Interesting. Borders raise distance traveled by 6.2%. What does it mean? If I have to go from a city that is 100 kilometers apart, if it is within the country, I'll have better roads and it will be shorter. But if it is always 100 kilometers, but I have to pass the border, the systems are not well organized and typically it takes longer to get there. So that's endogenous from the choice of infrastructure, for instance. Also, you can, for example, look at surveys. You can look at surveys of values. There are these surveys in which they ask Europeans, from many, many different regions, ages, gender, whatever. They ask questions like, do a statement, do you agree with this statement, or do you disagree with this statement? Do you think about that, and so on. So, for example, we observe that borders increase, once again, this is a mistake, decrease by 30% the disagreement in values. It makes us to agree on values much more than you are in different places. So that's it. That's what I wanted to tell you. I wanted to tell you a little bit, give you a flavor of some of the research I've been doing on these questions of how trade, globalization, and political structure are met together. And we do a lot of work on how globalization affects countries and the welfare of people through markets. But sometimes we do very little about how it affects it through the changes in governments. But the makeup of governments, in this particular case, the geographical makeup of governments, is affected by globalization, as there are other aspects of governments. You know, for example, that countries that are more globalized have larger governments, even if they larger governments in terms of spending as a share of GDP. These are larger in terms of area, but also they can be large in terms of the private versus the public sector. The public sector is larger in open economies. Why? And so on. That will be some other lecture in some other day. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Jaume, is it okay if we entertain some questions from the
Oh,
students?
yes.
Yeah? Okay,
Yes.
so.
In terms of your theory, when it comes to like the Brexit in 2016, what was, in terms of your theory, like the main objective on the UK? It was too expensive for them to keep the unit. So what, in terms of your theory, how it reacted, you know?
It is true. One way to think about how I would apply this theory, which I haven't done or I haven't looked at it in any serious manner, is to say preference matching, perhaps. You see, what has made British more uncomfortable, for the right or the wrong reasons, but as empirical statement, what has made more uncomfortable of the Union is after the accession, is the enlargement, the accession, the countries came into the Union, the increase in the size of the Union. The Union has now a much larger, diverse population. Per capita incomes within the Union vary substantially, and so on. And perhaps the British became less happy with that. That's what that the theory would tell you a little bit. But there are, but this is a theory about main trends, and please remember that a few hours before they ended up collecting the votes, we still thought that this could never happen. So it was the kind of thing that randomness plays a big, big role. It's not like the entire population decided it was a bad idea for the UK. It's just that it was almost a tie, technically.
Thank you.
But still, I find that interesting.
Well, I was thinking if you use an assumption of if borders are defined by democracy or some, because I was thinking during the exposition that it's the people who is defining the border that they want, but it possibly is someone else, is some, I don't know, prime minister or someone is deciding that in their favor and not in the favor of the people. And this is one of the first question. And the second one is, at the end, borders are something that exists only in the imagination of people. So, for example, I don't know, Colombia and Spain, we have a lot of trade. Possibly we are less different than you and Germany. I don't know, Spain and Germany. This is something that someone in the master told me that some days ago. And I was thinking of that, possibly the borders, what do you mean by borders? Because possibly, yeah, this is close in geographical sense, but I don't know, possibly there are other ways that we are more close than in the space.
A border is a very precise thing, is the edge of a national government. Most of the countries in the world are continuous in space, and as a result, you take the border as the edge, or being within the territory or not. That doesn't mean that a border is like we are all very different. Countries that do have a border can be more or less different. What does the theory say? Whether it comes before or not? Let me tell you just two things to answer your question. Strategic, so we ignore a little bit domestic conflict. So everybody within the country has the same views. That's certainly not true. Okay, everybody within the regional unit, and we have we analyze two sort of equilibria. One of them, which would be with law and diplomacy, and another would be with war and conquest. With war and conquest, you might be in an empire without wanting to be there. It can be imposed on you. So it's part of the theory that as well.
I have a question. So accordingly to your theory, let's say in an empire, right? I have a lot of more area, less frontiers. Then the effect will be lower.
Trade within the empire will be easier, and there will be more trade within the empire than afterwards, than others. In fact, the fact that these empires existed in the past and then they broke down still are generating, we still have inertia, and there's a lot more trade between former metropolis and the countries that were colonized than among other countries. Why? Because the metropolis, the countries that colonize the others, they impose their culture, their language, their rules, and so on. And that's why Colombia might be similar to Spain, even though it was a colony at some point. Institutions were taken there, and these institutions and these rules and so on are still there in some way, and that makes us closer in some ways. So in these empires, they reduce the costs of trade. Some of these costs of trade, once the countries separate, might return, but some of the cost of trade might be reduced forever. And that's some of the effects of empires. In fact, we know that former French colonies trade a lot with France, former British colonies trade a lot with Britain, and that might be true even though the process of separation was traumatic. If there was a war or there was something. After a while, the fact that these institutions were created and these ways of operating were creating, that facilitates trade. That's one of the effects of having different governments, or not having different governments. You have a question? Yes.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first one is if you included during the definition of a border, if it was like a regional or like a province or country.
National. Only national.
Only national? Because maybe there could be another effect of border effect within the region. And the other one is if you studied the effect of the union, like how was the border effect before the European Union and after the European Union, so you can check if the European Union is leading the bloc towards unity or not.
I like your questions very much. The first one on the regional borders. The regional borders actually are important, are quite important. A lot of what I was mentioning about procurement, home bias in procurement, it's very strong at the regional level. The government of Catalonia buys from Catalonia, doesn't buy from other places. The government of Aragon buys from Aragon, and very little. But Aragon, there are a few things might buy more. But there is a very strong home bias, and regional borders do matter. And in some additional work, we have been able to establish that. Now, the second question, I would love to know what was the border effect before. But this data that we had on the shipment of goods via trucks that allowed us to construct the map of trade in manufacturing, in 12 industries, not in services, but in 12 industries. The one that we did is a survey that we had from 2011 to 2017. It's no way we can find this type of data before. And in order to assess that, you have to compare trade within country and trade across countries. And if I don't have trade within countries recorded anywhere, I cannot answer. It's one of these things that we say, it's a fantastic question, but it's unanswerable given the data that we have right now. That's it. Very good. Thank you.